Pickled vegetables are a staple in the daily meals of Chinese people. This side dish not only stimulates the taste buds, but also reduces the greasiness of fatty foods. I mention this particular dish because, in today's case, this humble food became the key to solving a crime scene that initially seemed to offer no clues. Join me as we travel back to 2007 to uncover the details of this intriguing case. Welcome to Crime Documentary Files. One late night in 2007, Wu Guoqing, a 51-year-old criminal investigation expert, was at his desk reviewing case files as usual. The room was enveloped in silence, and darkness filled the view outside the window. Suddenly, the phone downstairs rang, shattering the silence. On the other end was the chief of the Shandong Provincial Police Department. The chief urgently informed him of a very serious murder case in the area. Due to the complex situation at the scene, the police needed the expertise of Mr. Wu Guoqing. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Mr. Wu agreed without hesitation, promising to arrive as quickly as possible. After hanging up, he hurried to his bedroom to pack for the trip. Once ready, he quickly hailed a taxi to the Shandong Provincial Police Department. Why is Mr. Wu Guoqing so trusted by police departments? You might be wondering. In the past, many criminals have been caught thanks to his intelligence and skills. With his extensive experience, Mr. Wu has developed a unique approach to handling cases. This is why the police chief reached out to him for help. I want to start with Mr. Wu because I want you to become his invaluable assistant, joining him at the crime scene to solve this challenging case. Upon arriving, a police officer quickly greeted Mr. Wu and took his luggage. The chief was overjoyed to see him and invited him for tea while recounting the events. However, not wanting to waste any time, Mr. Wu requested to speak with the witnesses and inspect the situation. The witness was Mr. Zuo, a middle-aged man and neighbor of the victim. Mr. Zuo recounted that on that morning, he went to visit his friend, Mr. Wen, who lived less than a kilometer away, to play chess. Mr. Wen's house usually opened early, but that day the door was still closed, which surprised Mr. Zuo. Most rural households don't keep their doors closed during the day, and Mr. Wen had a scheduled appointment with him at 7 a.m. This puzzled Mr. Zuo greatly. Seeing that the door was ajar, Mr. Zuo entered. On the floor lay Mr. Wen in a pool of blood, lifeless. Terrified, Mr. Zuo, fearing suspicion, decided to shout for help. Some neighbors, hearing the cries, immediately rushed over. They broke down the door to investigate and soon called the police. The local police arrived, secured the scene, and began their investigation. The chief continued, detailing the scene to Mr. Wu. The scene was heartbreaking. In the living room, Mr. Wen's body lay on his back in a pool of blood, with multiple stab wounds of varying depths. The injuries suggested the weapon was likely an agricultural tool. The attacker seemingly struck Mr. Wen down immediately. He was wearing old, worn clothes, now soaked with fresh blood. The living room was undisturbed with no signs of theft. Only a spilled teacup on the table hinted at a struggle. There were blood droplets leading from the body to the kitchen. Following the blood trail to the kitchen, everyone was stunned to find another body on the floor. Strangely, the kitchen was also undisturbed. The second victim was likely taken by surprise, as there were no signs of a struggle that would have disturbed the surroundings in the small kitchen. The victim was identified as Mr. Wen's daughter-in-law, Ms. Zhang. Her body bore numerous wounds inflicted by the same weapon used to kill Mr. Wen. The deepest wound was on her back, indicating that the assailant struck her forcefully from behind, causing her to collapse immediately. To ensure she was dead, the perpetrator inflicted multiple additional wounds on her body. Ms. Zhang kept the kitchen impeccably tidy. Dishes were neatly stacked in the cabinets, and spices were organized in small jars on the shelves. Although nothing was cooking on the stove, there was a small bag of cucumbers on the floor, likely intended for an upcoming meal. The kitchen had minimal furnishings, with only a rice bin, some firewood, and a large jar in the corner. Despite its small size, the kitchen was very orderly. Remember these items, as they will soon become crucial in solving this case. At this moment, a panicked officer rushed out to report the discovery of another body in the bedroom. Tragically, this victim was a 10-year-old girl. Her body lay in a pool of blood, evoking immense sorrow from everyone who saw it. Like the other rooms, the girl's bedroom showed no signs of robbery. Thus, this couldn't have been a murder-robbery, but likely a crime driven by personal vendetta. The police continued searching the house for clues. While examining the backyard, they found a machete discarded in the grass. The blade was covered in blood, but the handle was clean, indicating the killer had wiped it down. Based on the initial examination and the evidence collected, the police formed two hypotheses. First, the fact that the killer did not spare even a child suggested a deep-seated grudge against the family. However, villagers stated that the Wen family was very sociable, had good relationships, and no disputes over property or land. Therefore, it seemed unlikely they were targeted by an enemy. Second, the murder weapon was a machete. The question arose, did the perpetrator bring the weapon, or did it belong to the victims? Neighbors confirmed it belonged to the Wen family, as they often borrowed it and remembered it well. Typically, rural machetes used for chopping wood are not as sharp as knives and are quite large, making them noticeable if carried around. If the assailant intended to kill, why didn't they bring a weapon? This suggested that the crime was not premeditated, but rather an impulsive act. From the bloodstains and the victim's positions at the scene, the police deduced that the killer first attacked Ms. Zhang in the kitchen, then went to the living room to find her father-in-law, and finally moved to the child's bedroom. The crime took place late at night, avoiding detection by the neighbors. The police were then informed that no fingerprints were found on the machete handle. This showed the killer was meticulous in erasing their traces. There were no useful clues in the house to identify the perpetrator. The night before the tragic events, no neighbors saw anyone entering or leaving the Wen home, nor did they hear any unusual noises. All these factors stumped the police. The chief of police immediately formed a special task force to broaden the investigation and interview all suspects in the village. Everyone with close ties to the Wen family, as well as individuals with criminal records, were brought in for questioning. Two individuals particularly close to Ms. Zhang were Ping Miaoqi, her sister's son-in-law, and Wen Huangdiao, her husband's cousin. The police questioned them in great detail. Peng Miaoqi was known to be heavily in debt. Out of compassion for his situation, Ms. Zhang had lent him a significant amount of money without ever demanding repayment. Despite not being blood-related, Ms. Zhang treated Peng Miaoqi like her own nephew. Grateful for her kindness, Peng Miaoqi often visited Ms. Zhang's home, playing with her children and helping with farm work. Mr. Wen also treated him well, always inviting him to stay for meals and sending him home with food. As Peng Miaoqi recounted these memories, he was on the verge of tears. He insisted that the Wen family were good people, with no personal grudges against anyone. The day before the tragedy, Peng Miaoqi had visited to help Ms. Zhang chop some wood, but had to leave urgently, missing dinner. The next morning, he was shocked to hear about the murders. Even while providing his statement to the police, he couldn't believe what had happened. Wen Huangdiao, who lived a few kilometers away, gave a similar account. He mentioned that Ms. Zhang's husband often brought gifts for his children whenever he returned from work. Ms. Zhang, known for her kind and generous nature, frequently shared delicious food with his family. Wen Huangdiao expressed deep gratitude for their kindness and couldn't imagine anyone having a personal vendetta against them. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of the murders, Wen Huangdiao stated, "My wife and I were at the farm preparing vegetables to sell at the market the next day. This was their primary source of income, and they always prepared meticulously. Many farmers were working with him that day, providing him with a solid alibi." After interviewing the two individuals close to the victim's family, the police turned their attention to those with criminal records. However, each suspect had an alibi. Another day passed, and the investigation grew more complex as no leads emerged. All the suspects provided no useful information, and the meticulous killer left no trace. Apart from the murder weapon, no other clues were found, leaving the case at a standstill. That evening, a police officer passing by Mr. Wen's house noticed a suspicious man loitering around. The officer, finding this odd, hid and observed. The man stood there for about 15 minutes, peering into the house before preparing to leave. The officer immediately confronted and detained him, bringing him to the station for questioning. The man identified himself as Liu Guangkai, a 35-year-old from Jiangsu province. He had worked at a local lumber yard until recently, when economic hardships led to his dismissal. Since then, Liu had been wandering in search of new employment, but found none due to his lack of qualifications. Liu Guangkai had met Ms. Zhang at a town eatery. One day, he forgot his money, and Ms. Zhang kindly paid for his meal. Learning of his circumstances, she helped him find work at the local market. Although he knew she was married, Liu Guangkai became infatuated with Ms. Zhang, making unwelcome advances and even visiting her home, only to be consistently rebuffed. Initially, Liu Guangkai denied visiting Ms. Zhang's house recently, but a neighbor's testimony forced him to confess. He admitted to spying on Ms. Zhang while she bathed, but denied any involvement in the murders. To verify his story, the police searched Liu Guangkai's lodging. His roommate and co-worker confirmed that Liu had been home, except for his market shifts. Liu Guangkai was eventually released after providing a solid alibi. At this point, the massacre had turned into a case with no leads and no other suspects. The aftermath was truly devastating. The small village had never experienced such a horrifying event. With the killer and the motive still unknown, many villagers feared they might be the next target. As a result, they took extreme precautions, keeping their doors tightly locked even during the day and leaving lights on at night to deter intruders. To reassure the community, local leaders demanded that the police resolve the case immediately and bring the perpetrator to justice. However, the investigation was slow due to the lack of evidence. This news reached senior officials, prompting the chief of the Shandong Provincial Police to establish a task force with dozens of members. He also personally called on the expertise of criminal investigator Wu Guoqing. This led to the meeting between Mr. Wu and the chief of the Shandong Provincial Police at the beginning of this video. To recap, everything I've shared so far comes from the chief's briefing to Mr. Wu. Now, as we return to the scene, Mr. Wu, having been fully briefed, requested to be taken to the crime scene to begin his investigation. Upon arrival, Mr. Wu immediately started his examination. He first inspected the exterior of the Wen family home, then moved inside. As described by the Shandong police, the scene revealed no useful clues beyond the murder weapon. Walking through the house, Mr. Wu deduced that the Wen family was very diligent. The home, inside and out, was clean and orderly. Miss Zhang, 37, was a homemaker, while her husband worked far away, leaving her daughter, and her father-in-law at home. Neighbors described the Wen family as kind and without enemies. With no other clues in the house, Mr. Wu realized the difficulty of solving the case. He questioned nearby residents, hoping to gather valuable information, but their statements mirrored what they had already told the local police. As everyone was feeling stumped, Mr. Wu suddenly noticed a tightly tied plastic bag lying on the kitchen floor. It appeared to contain pickled vegetables, a clue initially found alongside the victim's body during the early investigation. Mr. Wu wondered why such a neat person like Ms. Zhang would leave a plastic bag on the floor. Then, it seemed like a realization struck Mr. Wu. He smiled and began searching the kitchen. "Do you recall the items I mentioned earlier?" "Yes. Besides the bag of pickles, another item I listed is related to this case. Can you guess what Mr. Wu is looking for? If not, let's follow him as he continues his search." Since the incident, Shandong police had examined the scene multiple times. They hadn't overlooked the bag of pickles on the floor, but they didn't realize it could be the key to solving the case. Seeing the tightly tied bag, Mr. Wu searched around the house. The police, now curious, wondered what he was looking for. After a while, Mr. Wu stopped in front of a small jar in the corner of the house. Pointing at it, he said to the police, "Open this jar." Although unsure of what to expect, the police immediately followed Mr. Wu's instruction to open the jar. As soon as it was opened, the pungent aroma of pickled vegetables filled the air. In China, jars are the preferred containers for pickling due to their superior hygiene compared to plastic buckets, and their large size allows them to hold substantial quantities. When there's an excess during the harvest season, villagers often pickle radishes, cabbages, and chili peppers to store for days when fresh produce is scarce. Mr. Wu wanted to verify if the pickles in the jar matched those in the plastic bag, so he tasted them. The results showed they were indeed the same, with identical flavor and sourness. This led Mr. Wu to conclude that the pickles in the bag came from the jar and weren't store-bought. If they had been taken out for eating, they would have been placed in a bowl, not a plastic bag, indicating that the pickles were meant as a gift for someone else. In rural China, People are known for their hospitality, often giving simple gifts like pickled vegetables, salted fish, or homegrown fruits to visitors. Thus, it was likely that the bag of pickles was a gift from the Wen family to the murderer, suggesting that the killer was an acquaintance, perhaps even a relative. This theory was further supported by the fact that even the 10-year-old child was killed, presumably to eliminate any witnesses. Based on this reasoning, Mr. Wu reconstructed the scenario as follows. Ms. Zhang, hearing that the visitor was about to leave, went to the kitchen to pack some pickles in a plastic bag. While she was preoccupied, the killer approached from behind and attacked her. After ensuring Ms. Zhang was dead, the killer picked up the bag of pickles, but then remembered the other two family members, Mr. Wen and Ms. Zhang's daughter, still in the house. Deciding to eliminate them as well, the killer set the bag down and went to the living room to kill Mr. Wen, then proceeded to the bedroom to murder the 10-year-old girl. To the murderer, the bag of pickles might have seemed inconsequential. However, to Mr. Wu, a seasoned criminal investigator, it revealed that someone familiar had committed the crime. After hearing Mr. Wu's theory, the task force members engaged in a lively debate. Some thought the theory was far-fetched, while others found it plausible. Mr. Wu's method of reconstructing the crime scene using evidence found at the scene, known as crime scene reenactment, was especially crucial in 2007, when rural areas lacked surveillance systems. Therefore, solving the case relied heavily on analyzing available clues to narrow down suspects. Following Mr. Wu's logic, the task force began investigating the Wen family's relationships. Some of the victims' relatives lived in the countryside, while others had moved away for work. This led one officer to consider Ms. Zhang's husband, Huang Taiyun. The officer questioned why no one had seen him since the murders occurred. Could he have committed the crime and fled? This suspicion was not without merit. According to neighbors, Huang Taiyun had been working in Jiangsu province. 3 days before the murders, Huang Taiyun was seen returning home, but he was nowhere to be found when the incident occurred. It was possible that he had returned to Jiangsu before the murders, or that he was involved and had fled. To verify this hypothesis, the police went to Huang Taiyun's workplace in Jiangsu. His colleagues stated that Huang Taiyun and another co-worker had left for a business trip to Henan province after his return home. They also mentioned overhearing a phone conversation between Huang Taiyun and his wife, in which he informed her of his arrival. While it was still unclear whether Huang Taiyun was the killer, Mr. Wu suddenly remembered someone else previously mentioned by the police. Do you recall the two people close to the victim's family? And do you remember that one of them didn't provide a clear alibi? Yes, the suspect Mr. Wu was thinking of was none other than Peng Miaoqi, Ms. Zhang's sister's son-in-law. The police immediately went to question Peng Miaoqi. Facing Mr. Wu, Peng Miaoqi once again detailed his relationship with the Wen family. He expressed deep affection for the family, describing them as not only his benefactors, but also as treating him exceptionally well. In the past, his debts had driven even his own mother to abandon him, but Ms. Zhang had lent him money to pay off his debts. For this, Peng Miaoqi felt eternally grateful and never forgot their kindness. He often visited their home, helping Ms. Zhang with farm work and enjoying their hospitality, including generous meals and thoughtful gifts. Peng Miaoqi's account was convincing and reasonable. Given how well the Wen family treated him and even lent him money, why would he kill his benefactors? One of the officers asked, could it be that the police have been investigating in the wrong direction? Facing the skepticism of his colleagues, Wu Guoqing smiled and said, even though Peng Miaoqi had a close relationship with the Wen family, that doesn't mean he had no motive to harm them. He added firmly, given that the suspect had repeatedly borrowed money from Ms. Zhang, it's possible that money issues led to a conflict. Such situations have happened before. However, this is still just a hypothesis. We need to investigate thoroughly to uncover the truth. Despite the police's accusations, Peng Miaoqi vehemently denied any involvement in the Wen family murders. The task force started to believe he might not be the perpetrator. However, Mr. Wu insisted on taking Peng Miaoqi to the crime scene to break down his psychological defenses. As predicted, upon arrival, Peng Miaoqi began to tremble, and his demeanor changed noticeably. He became fearful and started speaking incoherently. The police were astonished, as Peng Miaoqi's behavior betrayed his lies. They suspected that his guilt over his actions had caused immense remorse, He began to cry, haunted by the gruesome crime and the sight of the dried blood on the floor. Capitalizing on this, Mr. Wu aggressively confronted him. Pointing at Peng Miaoki, Mr. Wu angrily said, "The Wen family treated you so well. They lent you money and welcomed you warmly. Ms. Zhang fed you and sent you home with gifts. How could you repay their kindness with such brutality, even killing a child? Do you even have a conscience?" These words seemed to break Peng Miaoki. He cried harder and finally confessed to his crimes. It turned out Peng Miaoki was a notorious gambler in the area, living under the burden of massive debts and being hunted by loan sharks. Despite this, he continued to frequent gambling dens, even trying to gamble on credit, only to be thrown out repeatedly. The Wen family, aware of his plight, had lent him money several times. Moved by their generosity, Peng Miaoki often helped Ms. Zhang with farm work as a way to repay their kindness. On the day of the crime, Peng Miaoki went gambling again. This time he was tricked by the other players. Initially, he won big, but soon after, he lost all his winnings. The more he lost, the more desperate he became to recover his losses, betting larger amounts each time until he was completely broke. Eventually, he was thrown out of the gambling den. The loan sharks demanded that Peng Miaoki repay his debts immediately, threatening his life if he didn't comply. Having lost all his money and burdened with even more debt, Peng Miaoki was too afraid to go home and face his wife's scorn. He remembered Ms. Zhang and rushed to her house to ask for a loan. Upon arrival, he confessed his gambling losses and pleaded for her help, promising to reform and never gamble again. Ms. Zhang, moved by his desperation, quickly took some money from a box and handed it to him, urging him to change his ways. Ms. Zhang repeatedly urged him, "You should find a proper job. If you continue like this, I'll never have enough money to lend you, even if I sell my house and land." Instead of taking her words to heart, Peng Miaoki's mind twisted in another direction. He realized that with his existing debt and new loans, he could never repay it all. Then, a horrifying thought struck him. If the Wen family were gone, he wouldn't have to repay the debt. Knowing the house well, he was aware of the machete's location. He decided to use it as his murder weapon. When Peng Miaoki mentioned he was leaving, Ms. Zhang went into the kitchen to pack some pickles in a plastic bag for him. Seizing the moment when she was distracted, he grabbed the machete and stabbed her. The fatal blow was so swift that she collapsed to the floor without a sound. After killing Ms. Zhang, Peng Miaoki was about to flee when he remembered the other two family members, Mr. Wen and Ms. Zhang's daughter. Realizing they could identify him to the police, he decided to eliminate them too. He dropped the bag of pickles, went upstairs to kill Mr. Wen, and then went to the bedroom to murder the 10-year-old girl. After committing the murders, Peng Miaoki wiped his fingerprints off the machete, left it at the scene, and fled. He thought he had covered his tracks perfectly and that the police would find no clues. However, he didn't anticipate that the bag of pickles he carelessly left behind would be the key piece of evidence to solve the case. According to the killer, since the crime, he had been plagued by nightmares every night. Each day, he lived in fear of the police showing up at his door to arrest him. These thoughts haunted him constantly, making his life unbearable. Peng Miaoki often contemplated suicide, but decided to live as long as possible before inevitably paying for his crimes. During interrogation, the police asked, "Did you think about the consequences when you committed the murders?" The killer, crying, replied, "At that moment, my mind was blank. It felt like someone else was controlling my actions, and I couldn't stop myself. But once I got home, I collapsed in overwhelming regret." The case, which seemed to be at a dead end, was solved quickly thanks to the expertise of criminal investigator Wu Guoqing. This case further enhanced Mr. Wu's reputation, leading to more recognition and opportunities to demonstrate his skills in other high-profile cases. In the end, money once again proved to be a driving force behind human crimes. However, it's not just about the money. It's also about individuals failing to control their materialistic desires. The most tragic aspect of today's case is the innocent victims, kind-hearted people who suffered due to someone else's greed. Through this case, we also get to know the renowned criminal investigator, Wu Guoqing. Thank you for watching today's video. Please leave your comments below to help us improve. If you have any other interesting cases, feel free to share them with us. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Documentary Files.